Very easy. Okay. Kia ora koutou. Good morning, everybody. Day 6, and we'll open with karakia from Kingi. Kingi.
Katau ko te rangi I runga nei, katau ko te papa e takoto nei, katau te aio, te rangi Māori e, me te aroha ki runga ki tēnei, winga ki roto ki tēnā o tātou ti hei mauri ora. I ngā reo, I ngā mana, I ngā ihi, I ngā wehi, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou. Koutou, ko tai mai nei ki tēnei whare, hara mai. Koutou, ko tai mai ki te whare o te kaungihera, hara mai. Koutou, ko tai mai ki te tūru nei, ki te whakapuaki, ki te whakatakoto kupu, whakatakoto whakaro, hara mai. Hara mai koutou, anei, nei hoki rā te kupu, kia koutou e te pai hirihi. Koutou e te pai ko tohua ki te tuku kōrero, ki te tuku kupu, hei arahitanga, mā te kaungihira tēnā koutou. Koe nei te rangi whakamutunga, he wā tōna, kāre roa, ka hoki atu koutou ki ngā whānau. Reira me tuku aroha ki ngā whānau, nā mātou te kaungihira. Te wā, te whakawātea ia koutou, ki te mahi I ngā mahi nui, ki te whakarongo ki ngā kōrero nei, no reira tēnā koutou. Me whai whakaro atu tātou ki a rātou ko mene atu. Rātou ko mene atu ki te pō, rātou ko eke ki ngā pau, ki ngā toi, o ngā tumu ki runga o tumu whakaibu. Rātou ko ngaro atu ki te hāhātanga o pipiri, ki aio, te noho, I roto I te hoki tamatu ki te kāinga tuturu rātou ki a rātou, tātou ki a tātou te pitora, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa, mei no I tātou. He honore he kororea ki te atua, he mau ngā rono ki te mata o te whenua he whakaro pai ki ngā tānata katoa anu. Ngaia I te atua he ngā kou hou, he ngā kou mā ki roto ki tēnā o mātou. Whakatohunia tō waiwa tapu, hei awhina he tohunia mātou, hei ara he hoki I roto I tēnei hui, I roto I tēnei kaupapa. Ngere tēnā koutou, he te whare, tēnā tātou I roto I te ārotanga o te kaupapa nei, ngere tēnā tātou katoa, te pai hiri, kei koutou te wā, mutu ana ngā mahi, ka hoki nei au, ki te whakakapi, ki te whakakōpani, I te ārotanga, ngere tēnā koutou katoa.
Right. Just two matters from me before we commence with witnesses. Just to report that commissioners went and did a little bit of a tiki tour around Matatua Marae and the surroundings yesterday, just to have a look at that sort of general context and following submissions that we received last Thursday. And the second matter is that we've received Ms. Fairgray's homework from last night. Thank you very much, Ms. Fairgray. Which is the supplementary statement addressing the question of average lot sizes and what that might mean in terms of numbers. and she hasn't quite managed to land on it. She's given us the option of 375 or 400. Thank you for the option. And we'll work our way through that. So thank you very much. So now day 6 and the last day of hearing scheduled anyway. So first up, gentlemen, it's Pukeroa. And sorry we weren't able to fit you in yesterday. There's always a bit of elasticity in these hearings, and you got the elastic. Yeah.
Thank you, Commissioners. Can you hear me okay? That's coming through? Yep. Yes, apologies for yesterday. We had all market a meeting to run to, so we thank you for scheduling us again this morning. We will only be brief. We've just got a couple of matters that we really want to touch on, which we think are quite important, certainly to the interests of Pukeroa Lakes Group Holdings, So just firstly, for those who do not know me, I'm Brett Farquhar. I'm a Senior Planner and Director of Stratum Consultants here in Rotorua. I've been in Rotorua for 15 years now, so I'm very familiar with the environment, the plans, and yeah. And with me, obviously, I've got Mark Gibb. Mark is the CEO of Pukeroa Lakes Group. Just a quick overview of Pukeroa. So it was the Pukeroa Lakes Trust. It's now a group, and it was established in 1981 for the purpose of administering the town sections on behalf of the beneficial owners of Ngāti Whakaui. For example, Pukeroa Lakes Holdings Limited, which is the mall at the south end of town, that's zoned City Centre 2. Pukeroa Lakes Holdings Limited was set up under the umbrella of the Pukeroa Lakes Group for the specific purpose of developing and managing that piece of land. Pukeroa Lakes Group have significant land holdings within the Rotorua Township, along with undertaking a number of developments such as the mall I just mentioned, Trade Central, which is Commercial 6, which is sort of the western end of town. Numerous office buildings within the city centre as well, and more recently the Waiariki Spa and QE Health buildings at the City Centre 3 on the northern end of town. And Stratum has continued to provide consultancy services and advice to Pukeroa since their establishment. Unfortunately, just through an administration error, I did not have sufficient time to produce a statement of evidence in line with the Commissioner's timing to support the Pukeroa submission. Therefore, this is just a verbal submission only. However, I do have copies here if you want to grab it at the I can hand it over at the end. Okay, thank you, sir. Okay, so I'll just discuss just a few submission points raised in the Pukeroa submission, which is number 37, starting with, and it's mainly around the rules of buildings within city centre and commercial zones within the district. Those are the key points that are significant to Pukeroa and their future developments. So the first one is the City Centre Rule 2, which allows for alterations and additions to existing buildings and facades. So new provisions were proposed in the city centre that require resource consent for alterations and additions to existing buildings. These are opposed by Pukeroa. It is proposed by council to now make these activities restricted discretionary. Now, for context, the current district plan allows for these alterations to the existing building facade in the city centre 2 zone as a permitted activity, and bearing in mind the city centre 2 zone is Rotorua Central Mall. In the city centre 1 zone, it is permitted activity if facade works just for maintenance, repair, or a controlled activity for external cladding if the external cladding has been modified. So that's the existing planning framework we've got at the moment. So the district plan framework should be, in our opinion, or my opinion, relaxed to encourage development and redevelopment of city centre buildings. Removing the resource consenting process would assist towards this, while also reducing time and cost associated with the process. The district plan can still be drafted in such a way that any permitted activity still has to meet certain performance standards to ensure the design of the building is controlled, or as council would like them to see, will be built. There's a rule in the plan at the moment that requires...
Just let me pause you there. Are there performance standards against the permitted activity now?
There are. I was just going to say, yeah. So that, for example, there's a rule or a standard requiring a veranda in the city centre. If you build a building and you have a veranda, it is a permitted activity. If you decide not to build a veranda or not build the veranda to the standards stipulated in the district plan, then you will actually have to go through a consenting process. So the district plan should not be making redevelopment more onerous or costly. Even in the simplest of resource consents can cost a developer significant time and money. So the council section 42A report did look at this a little bit deeper after submissions, and suggested providing thresholds of redevelopment areas as a permitted activity. And that they talked about 25 square metres of the main street or the facade of a building on the main street, to Tenoko Street, or 100 square metres on other streets. And they also talked about a threshold of 100 square metres of gross floor area. However, in my opinion, this just provides another layer of confusion and uncertainty. It would be simpler to just remove these provisions in their entirety and make them permitted. Building owners should be encouraged to continually update and redevelop their city centre buildings to keep them modern and tidy. This only improves the amenity of the city centre. Adding a layer of bureaucracy just will discourage this. And I also just note here, this was supported by another submitter, number 79, Geo Consultants. So moving on to City Centre Rule 3 for new buildings. Similar vein, really. It's proposed to make these new buildings a restricted discretionary activity. So any new building within the city centre, a restricted discretionary activity. And for context, again, the current district plan allows for new buildings in the City Centre 2 zone as a permitted activity. So again, City Centre 2, the mall, and the City Centre 1 zone, it is currently a controlled activity. So again, I disagree with the Section 42A report conclusions on this matter, that the restricted discretionary activity status for new buildings is the most efficient and effective method to ensure that new development achieves quality design outcomes. New buildings in the CBD have been developed recently, and they're all of a high quality design. I'm not aware there has been any recent CBD building design issues. It appears changes have been made to the district plan for change's sake, rather than actually addressing a problem or an adverse effect on the city centre environment. And I'm sure the commissioners have been around the city. There are a number of new buildings, and I would have thought, well, in my opinion, they're good looking buildings. And again, this opinion was also supported by Geo Consultants, submitted number 79. So moving on to Rule 2 in the commercial zone, alterations and additions to existing buildings. Again, alterations to the building facade in the commercial 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6 zones are permitted activity. For context, the current district plan allows for these alterations to building facades in commercials 2 to 6 zones as permitted. In the commercial 1 zone, it is a controlled activity. And the commercial 1 zone is Nongata. It is proposed to be restricted discretionary unless under 25 square metres of alterations. So without wanting to repeat myself, for the reasons I outlined above, they should be remained as permitted, or certainly as the district plan is currently drafted. And just comment on Rule 3, new buildings in the commercial zones. Again, they are permitted in commercial 2 to 6 zones, and the commercial 1 zone is restricted discretionary and is proposed to make all of these restricted discretionary within the new rule framework. So again, the district plan should not be making redevelopment more onerous and costly. For the same reasons as I outlined above, the relief request is to retain alterations and new buildings in the commercial zones as permitted activities, or at least the same as the current district planning framework. Submissions were also made in support of a number of rules within the city centre, namely City Centre Rule 16, which allows residential living in the city centres 1 and 2 zones, along with Rule 38 that allows for residential living in the city centre 3 zone. So just wanted to reiterate that we support that change within the district plan. Likewise, submissions and support were also made to rules in the commercial zones 32 that allow for residential living in the commercials 2, 4 and 6 zones. Allowing for residential living in these commercial zones will allow people to live and work and play near their convenience businesses and their workplaces. So promoting a mixed use live, work, play environment should be encouraged. So these PC9 provisions in the Section 42A report conclusions are supported. So that's all we have to say. Thank you for your time, and Mark and I are happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Farquhar. Mr. Gibb, anything that you want to add before we go to questions?
Just a couple of very quick points, if I could, Commissioners Morena. Firstly, from an overall trust perspective, we're broadly supportive of Plan Change 9. Secondly, as a general observation, we've found that other local communities, towns and cities have adopted reasonably proactive statutory planning frameworks over recent years, and we're again broadly supportive of Rotorua advancing forward with PC9 in work that's being done at the moment around the future development strategy. And from a landowner's perspective, why that's incredibly important to us is if we do not keep pace with those, we're finding that key tenants that we have are leaking out of the city to other locations. Third point, and this sort of plays to the broader objective of PC9, is a number of our sites have strong intermodal characteristics. For example, Rotorua Central Mall is a confluence of private transport, public transport, taxis, bus services, etc. A number of the shuttles towards the airport, etc., also utilise that node. So board intensification and actually building up and not out on that site makes an awful lot of use. In the future, genesis and opportunity for that site really exists in and around the airspace that's highly underutilised across it. The fourth point is, just given the scale of the trust holdings across the city, we have an advantage over others in the sense that we can take a comprehensive master planned approach towards development. So as you would have observed, there's a lot of, I suppose, aggregated land ownership across the CBD in the city. The trust has the benefit of owning significant tranches of land, which means we can adopt a master planned approach. We have a strong view from a qualitative perspective in terms of the type of development we're undertaking, whether it be commercial or from a housing point of view. And the last point is just really around a capital recycling perspective. The trust itself, we're about a $400 million business as we sit at the moment. A number of the proceeds from a commercial perspective that we generate get pushed back down through to the beneficial owners of the trust through a series of health grants and other grants that are paid through via dividends. But we also have a very strong housing and social focus. So we own a reasonably significant residential portfolio at the moment. And PC9 would enable us to re-intensify and use more effectively the land holdings we do have, which is of immediate benefit to those at Whakapapa Te Whakaui and to others that require accommodation in the city. So I just wanted to leave you with those brief thoughts, if I could, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gibb. Appreciate that.
Kia ora. Two questions from me. In relation to one of your submissions points was about removing proposed height restrictions as permitted activities in the city centre. I can't recall if you were still here when Ms. Fairgrave was giving her submission yesterday morning, but I asked a similar question to her then, and the response was that the market, i.e. you guys, would typically build to about the 32-metre height anyway, and it presented a height that was feasible in terms of construction costs and so on. So just wondered if you had any commentary to make regarding your submission to remove heights. Mr.
Certainly, yes, we did put that submission point in. Obviously, that was just an opinion in terms of enabling development and flexibility, whether it be 32 metres, 42 metres, 52 metres. If the market dictated a certain building, then why not allow it? However, due to time and cost and things like that, we did not sort of engage a landscape architect to support that with any sort of evidence. So hence why I didn't discuss it today. But obviously, it comes down to the more flexibility, the better from a commercial perspective.
Yeah, and just building on those comments, if I looked at the characteristics of, for example, Rotorua Central Mall, that is a very significant site by size. From our perspective, to go high on that makes an awful lot of sense. So if I looked at the model adopted at, say, Sylvia Park, in which, that's potentially 10 to 15 years ahead of where we are at the moment. We have an immature intensified residential market in Rotorua at the moment. But if I use that as an example, loaner of retail through commercial, through residential makes an awful lot of sense. Given the setbacks and the boundaries on that site, we would not have issues with respect to recession prone, encroachment, etc. So on certain pieces of real estate through the city, it would make an awful lot of sense from our view to have an unrestrained height envelope and to simply focused on performance standards.
Kia ora. Just one other point for clarification, really. I'm aware, I'm from Te Aroha myself, so looking forward to taking advantage of the whakaue discount for the Wairiki Spa in due course. That's not for the record or anything. Oh, it is too late. It's already been recorded. Anyway.
It was recorded.
When we drove around, we could also see a lot of the residential development that was occurring, and we're told this is whakaue, that's whakaue, but I'm aware there's different entities. So not really one to put you on the spot, but when we say whakaue developing residential, who do you mean in there?
Certainly. I think the four entities under the whakaue banner all have quite a specific identity and purpose. So if I looked at the trust really, the genesis of the trust comes down to a series of settlements that have occurred extensively around the CBD isthmus. So that's our area of focus. If I looked at tribal lands as an example, with Whanganui, that's a different area outside our area of jurisdiction, but we do work together in terms of an overarching residential approach across the tribe and across the group. So that really is their business. And then we obviously have tribal lands and education endowment. Now, education endowment also have a significant asset base within the CBD. So we're working very closely with them, especially around a lot of the older leasehold sites that ultimately, have a huge upside opportunity around bringing those land blocks together and rethinking and repurposing those sites in the future. So yeah, our focus is extensively CBD. We do stretch our tentacles out as time goes on, but as you'll be aware, there's no formal boundary the way things are. So we all have a look into each other's backyards around what's going on in general terms.
Thank you.
Yeah, and if I could just sort of elaborate a little bit on that. So Pukeroa Wharewhara Trust or Group is primarily commercial development. However, on the lakefront land, there are apartments proposed to be built there. Pukeroa also have residential zoned, actually it might be commercial zoned land, but down on Mead and Froud Street, which is near Sala Street down the southern end of town. So that is also Pukeroa owned land, which has residential. In fact, you've developed it recently to add more housing on there for the beneficiaries. Yeah.
Thank you. We've people appear before us if they wish to, and you have. So I'm just interested if you're interested. It's not asking to provide evidence, but an opinion. Really, you're in the market, so just wondering what your sense is from others that are in the residential and commercial development market in terms of where PC9 has landed. If you have a view on that, or good if you don't want to share that view.
Yeah, I think maybe from a purely with a commercial lens on that, my sense is, Rotorua is yet to really understand and grasp the benefit of intensification. We don't have good precedent models within the city that people can actually naturally gravitate to understand what an intensified model actually looks like. We're still potentially where others were a number of years ago in and around single lots, standalone dwellings. So, there's a bit of it coming through. But I think we've got a number of years, and it will be a slow burn to actually get to the point in which people have trust and confidence in and around, what a duplex, what a three-level townhouse, these sort of things actually start to look like. I think it's just a market maturity issue, and the more that the zoning framework permits it, the more that developers actually come in and embrace it and have confidence in the model, the more the market supports it. And I think, there is a reality there at the moment that the market may not quite be there in terms of supporting that sort of product into the market at the present time. But my sense is that will happen, over the next few years as the market re-emerges out of COVID. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Just like to try and understand a little bit better your concern with the council's proposal for restricted discretionary activity consent as opposed to controlled, for example, or even permitted. I don't think it can be a concern regarding notification because the rules put before us exclude public notification and limited notification. So your concern can only be about the council's assessment of your proposal. Given that the PC9 increases the height limits in the COM zones and the CC1 zone, it would seem to me that it's entirely reasonable for a council to retain discretion over anyone who wants to exceed those greater height limits. So I'm really struggling to understand your concern, and I imagine a responsible developer would easily comply with the assessment criteria in the various matters of discretion as I viewed them. So what's the problem?
So just so I get the question correct, so are you talking about developers that go over the height limit? Yeah, so there's no dispute there that would require resource consent. I guess what we're saying is if a development can be designed within the parameters of performance standards, then why not make it permitted?
I don't think it's appropriate for a council to retain some kind of discretion over the building design, appearance of the building, sort of typical urban design matters. I mean, you might be a responsible developer, but I'm not sure all developers would build a nice building.
Yeah, look, I'm aware a lot of planning is planning for the lowest common denominator, I suppose, and I get that. However, I just wonder, I look around the city and I see the newer buildings that have been built up, and I know they're all controlled activities, but the ones I've been involved with, there was very little council input. We wrote a resource consent. We had an architect design the building. We drafted a resource consent. We had it lodged. We had some RFIs, mainly probably around engineering, and then it was approved. And I guess from my professional opinion, I just kind of see that as, why are we wasting 2 or 3 months and some dollars for achieving the same outcome as a permitted activity?
Wonder if I can just step in here. I mean, the challenge that you've put on the table for us is that if there are performance standards attached to the permitted activity status, then you'd be comfortable, but you haven't provided us with the performance standards. So back to you. If you want to, over the next 24 hours, float in what your proposition would be to have permitted performance standards, then we'll receive those and we'll take that into consideration. But in the absence of that, of course, you haven't left us with an option.
Yep, noted.
And just another question, which you may have already answered, but I'll just ask it again anyway. If as a developer you were to build a residential new build, either in the COMS zones or the CCZ zones, what type of typology as a developer would you be opting for? Is it going to be 3 stories, 4 stories, 5 stories, 6 stories, or not interested at all?
Yeah, we haven't, to be completely honest with you, we're yet to get to a point of a full-blown demand and supply study in and around different topology options. We've certainly got a view around what best in class looks like in terms of housing built form topology, from a design control perspective. Given the absence of any mandated urban design panel controls within the city, which I think personally we could do better at. It would be good to see some strong guidance in and around what built form looks like in this area. We'll take a strong lead in around it. But I think that's just, we're probably a year or two off actually getting to that point.
I mean, that you may want to consider that as one of the prerequisites, basically, of an application, which is a design. Whether there's a design panel, whether council doesn't have a design panel. Is there any intention at the moment to consider that option going forward? Right. Okay. All right. Well, that's the answer, I suppose.
Yeah, because I guess a lot of other councils do have urban design guides, even provincial councils that I'm familiar with. So
Yeah, that's right. Back many moons ago, and we did have a design guide for buildings within the CBD. Jason, you might recall, but that sort of just fell by the wayside over the years, and it talked about colours of buildings and trying to keep them.
I was going to say that the drift of your submission to us, I wouldn't have thought that that's what you were looking for. So I'm not really surprised about that. Yeah. Well, thank you, gentlemen, for your time this morning. And as I say, if you want to float in your proposition for what might be performance standards for a permitted activity status for buildings, be my guest. But without something like that on our table, the chances of hauling the trout are not great. Yeah. Go. Now, you had a comprehensive submission, so thank you for that. Obviously, we have read that, so just if you want to touch the high points of that.
Yeah.
And give us some detail about yourself.
Yeah. Reinforce the key points that I'd made in the submission.
I'm assuming you're an architect or
No,
civil. You're not. You came very
retired
close to
forester.
an architectural submission.
No,
Yeah,
not
right.
at all.
Well done. Yeah.
So the key point really was what struck me with the design specs for this were the risk of shading for certain properties at certain times of year. I'm not against intensification. In fact, while I'm a forester, not an urban planner, I'm very much in favour of the recognition for the long term that there has to be a big change in the way we live, and intensification is one of the tools in the toolbox. What struck me, and I emphasise I personally may not be affected in any way if someone built one of these next to me because of the way my house is designed, but I was struck by the fact that if you had a property or a house that was specifically owing to the design, the orientation of the section and the house itself, aimed as it probably naturally would be in the right situation towards the north and northwest, with the design limit of 11 metres, despite the recession plane, you could lose sun for a very substantial part of the year. And it just strikes me that that is very counterproductive to the health and well-being of the neighbours. So, and I put the little technical thing in there to illustrate how that might happen. The main issue around that, of course, is it could be codified. If one was saying that it is unacceptable that someone can be shaded for that period of time, there could be a decision made that that needs to be brought into the calculations. The sun goes in predictable patterns, and a decision could be made that codified while still retaining permitted activity status and the underlying intent. So that was the main one. And I guess the other two were much more general. The two themes were more general. One was that I was concerned that when you're operating and intensifying in an already occupied urban environment, how do you maintain green space? The specifications that were provided in in the documents are all internalised to the actual new development and don't relate in any way to the surrounds or the neighbours. And while there were statements about trying to maintain some amenity, acknowledging notwithstanding that it will change, I fail to see any real mechanism by which council could actually control that. And that, as one can see when one looks around Christchurch and Auckland and certain areas, some you would say are very good and some you might argue are not going to be very good in a few years' time. So I was just raising it. I don't have a particular solution as to how the planners may try and build that in, but I felt it was important that that be given more consideration. And the final point, which is somewhat out of the scope, but nevertheless, I thought worth adding in for future consideration, was that there is a burgeoning market for people trying to get into small houses, tiny houses, and that is another tool in the toolbox to provide for densification, lower cost, and also security, which is the huge problem with rental accommodation, as I would understand it. And that perhaps council should give some thought as to whether there is a program it can start to think about in terms of how to build opportunities for well-constructed, modern, not the rusting bus out the back, tiny houses that provide low-cost, healthy, good living standards, possibly even in communities. So that was essentially all I wanted to reinforce.
Thank you, Ms. Richards. Appreciate that.
Thank you. I too thought you were an architect or something like that. Well, so thank you.
Yeah, I was a frustrated architect, which is the next best thing, isn't it? Yes, right. Thanks, Ms. Richards. Okay. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Tēnā koutou katoa, noa airangi mi I ngā rangi o kutupuna, I whānā mai au ki te rākai pai whenua, kei Rotorua aho I nohu ana. Hei kaitohu tohu taio aho, ko Dave Marshall, tōko ingoa. My ancestors are from Ireland and England. I was born on Auckland's North Shore. I now live in Rotorua. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. I am an environmental policy advisor, a planner of some 25 years experience. However, this is not a statement of expert evidence. It is a personal statement from me as a Rotorua resident. I am appearing before you as a further submitter supporting primary submissions 4, 8, 20 and 84, which I can briefly summarise as opposing the imposition of the medium density residential standards in Rotorua. I recognise that as a further submitter, the relief I can seek from you as commissioners is limited, and further, the relief you can grant in relation to the MDRS is restricted as it must be in accordance with the provisions of the Resource Management Enabling Housing Supply and Other Matters Amendment Act 2021. As I seek the withdrawal of the MDRS provisions in their entirety from the Rotorua urban area, what I seek you cannot grant. Nevertheless, I request that I have the opportunity to complete this short statement today. First, I wish to make it clear that I am concerned by the housing shortage in this country and our city. In my view, Aotearoa New Zealand functions best as a home-owning democracy, and I have seen firsthand the appalling impact of the housing shortage on people's lives. Clearly, building more homes is the solution to this issue. I do not believe Plan Change 9 and the MDRS are the solution to this issue. In my view, Council's own analysis and reports demonstrate that there is a more than adequate availability of residentially zoned land and development potential. In my view, the MDRS, and in particular the provision for 3 dwellings per site, 11-metre height, 1 metre side yards, 4 metres plus 60 degrees height in relation to boundary recession plane, 50% building coverage, and total of 70 to 80% impermeable surface area will be highly detrimental to Rotorua. Detrimental in terms of future urban planning, infrastructure provision, and urban amenity at a site-specific and local scale. I understand that the MDRS is being imposed on Rotorua under the provisions of the Amendment Act and the Order in Council of 14th March 2022 that directed Rotorua Lakes Council to incorporate the MDRS into the district plan. However, clearly that Order in Council would never have been made had not Rotorua Lakes Council resolved on 25th of November 2021 to seek the imposition of the MDRS in the Rotorua urban area and then requested that imposition in submissions to the Amendment Act and letters to the Minister for the Environment. In my view, that resolution of Council back in 2021 was made without proper evaluation or consultation. In my view, that decision fails the policy evaluation tests set out in the Local Government Act. It may also fail the legal tests. I'm pursuing the options available to challenge the decision of Council to seek the imposition of the MDRS so that a proper evaluation and consultation process can be carried out. In summary, as an experienced planner, I do not want the MDRS to happen in the city I have chosen to call home. I want Council to give me the right to be heard that was denied by the hasty and, in my view, ill-conceived decision to seek the imposition of the MDRS in Rotorua. Thank you again for your time today. I realise this is not strictly a matter relevant to the decisions you have to make. However, I felt it important to present this statement at the hearings to Plan Change 9.
Thank you, Mr. Marshall. And do I take it from your the latter part of your submission here that you're seeking a judicial review of that decision?
And that is an option that's available.
Right.
I mean,
if you haven't yet commenced those proceedings, then I guess
that has not commenced yet, and I have not yet had a legal opinion on that matter. I'm merely presenting my policy evaluation.
That's fine. I was just curious as to whether or not such proceedings might actually be fixed before we are due to report. That's my very personal interest in that issue. Right.
Right, I understand.
Right.
Mr. Marshall, did you used to work for Rotorua?
Yes, yes, I
I
did.
thought I recognised your face. Good to see you again. Kia ora.
Kia ora.
Yes.
Good to see you too.
And I accept you're not giving a professional opinion because that would be problematic for you. So that's fine.
Yes.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Marshall.
It's a question of time and money in terms of seeking that legal opinion and judicial review. And I recognise, an ideal world would be getting that in motion now, but it can't happen without the funds. Thank you.
Well, thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak on my objections to the intensified housing in Rotorua. A fairly brief, gentlemen, but I felt that it was my duty to express some of my concerns. Rotorua is well known worldwide as a tourist destination, and I feel that with bringing high intensified housing into Rotorua would lessen the appeal of Rotorua as a highly classified international tourist destination. And just sort of building on that a little, we look at what has happened with the reputation that Rotorua has gone through for the homeless coming into Rotorua, and with a lot of these accommodations that are going to be made available will be housed by some of the people that have caused a lot of this problem on Fenton Street. My concerns there are that for residential homes, families that have spent years and years building up their equity and their livelihood could be well destroyed if one of these units comes up in close proximity or beside these houses. The values would drop considerably. The chances of them selling to go out probably would be zero. They've lost so much equity. They can't shift. They don't want to stay there, but they've got no option. I think that this is a tragedy that should be avoided. The call out that police have had from homeless coming into Rotorua, figures that I've had given to me, I hope they are correct, but I've been told it's up to 900% increase in call outs from the Rotorua police to the problems that homeless have caused. Not all homeless can be categorised in this manner. It only takes a handful and then everything falls apart. But we don't know what or who's going to go into these homes, and the people living beside them, if this building rule goes ahead, is going to pay an extremely dear price when they've paid their rates for years and years and years to have everything destroyed. I just don't think anyone's got a God-given right to destroy somebody's home and assets that they've spent so long building up. Just touching briefly, sir, on the fact that we've had a World Cup and these teams entering into that competition were allocated areas around New Zealand. Unfortunately, Rotorua was never on the list for that because of the reputation that we'd had gone beforehand. And we've paid a very, very dear price already on what homeless have caused Rotorua. As I said, I'm not against housing homeless, but it's got to be done in a more democratic way. And I don't believe this is a democratic process that has been put forward to Rotorua. This is more, in my opinion, very much a hard-driven socialist move. When you have something driven that's gone through a very fast track, tends to fall apart at stages. And I think this is what can happen here. A fast fix doesn't always mean that it's going to work out right. And you wind up with nothing much more than a long pain at the end of the whole day. So I think that the high density housing should be looked at more thoroughly, and it should be allocated into areas. It's not going to cause the destruction of residents and communities that have spent so long in Rotorua. Rotorua has previously held the distinction of being the most beautiful city in New Zealand, not once or twice, but on several occasions. And unfortunately, this could be well and truly removed from that agenda if we have a lot of high-rise housing going up in suburbs. And we could be looked upon as having Rotorua becoming a low-cost housing for homeless. So where do we go with homeless? Where do we put these high rises? And gentlemen, I do feel that there is an area that we can seriously look at that's not going to create the uncertainty and the destruction that it could do. And my view is that if we look out towards the airport area, there's a vast area of land out there which is Maori owned and Maori controlled. I know some of it in some areas is being used for housing. The majority of the time, no. The infrastructure's all out there. The shopping is out there. The medical centre's out there. The school's out there. And there's a big hub for kids and adults, if they like, to be entertained out there. So what's the problem? Why is this land not being used? So I would feel that perhaps it's time that our council, the Ministry of Housing, and the Maori delegation sit around the table and discuss and find out why. I'd just like, gentlemen, to read a very small quote from a very famous, by a very famous politician by the name of Winston Churchill. And he states that it takes a brave man to stand up and speak, but it takes braver and smarter men to sit around the table and find the solution, unquote. And I feel that perhaps it's time that we started looking in those directions, take a big step backwards. Don't push this program forward until we have the right agenda and the right policies in place. I don't believe that we do at the moment. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Steiner. And you're very plain speaking and very plain views, so thank you for those. Thank you. Well, very clear. So thank you. Mr. Steiner, you had nothing to add? All right. Well,
No,
thank
she
you.
wants to stay out of it.
Well, thank you for coming today.
Your orders before you sat down.
Yeah.
She gave me your orders before you sat down.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, and I wish you all the best.
I guess, so we weren't able to contact this person and no longer available. All right, so that's formally not appearing. Right, what's the time? 10:23. No, not coming in, not coming in at all. We might take a coffee break, as you marshal your resources, and then we'll come back and hear from council. So what's it now? 22? We're back at 22. That's time enough for you? Okay, all right, let's. Right, we're back. Thank you, council.
We've got 3 parts to our reply that we'd like to present today. The first is that supplementary statement of evidence from Ms. Fairgrave, which I propose to deal with first. So I'll ask Ms. Fairgrave to go first. I do then also have a short memorandum regarding procedural matters from this point, where I've suggested where we go from here. And then I will just present a very brief verbal closing just on one of the issues.
Over to you, but we don't think we need to hear from Ms. Fairgrave. I mean, her statement is very clear. We understand what it says. So unless there's anything supplementary to the supplementary, I don't think we actually need it. Yeah.
No, I don't believe there is at this stage.
Yeah.
So if you have no questions,
right.
then that's completely fine.
No, really. I mean, the issue on our table now is whether it's 375 or whether it's 400 or whether it's nothing. So those three options are very clear. Yeah. Right. So that's one gone.
Excellent. In which case, I'll move on to my memorandum. I'll just pop
Thank you.
into the for that. Now, I thought I'd just provide a short memorandum to make it straightforward to make the directions, but also just to let all the submitters know where we go from here in case they don't happen to be watching the live stream today. So just by way of introduction, I've just outlined there at the outset the directions that we are suggesting, and that is that all supplementary evidence from submitters be provided by this Friday. A reply from the Council's 42A authors by the following Friday, 1st of September, and then closing legal submissions by the following Wednesday. There are two matters we're proposing to provide later, and they are the updated future development strategy following the hearing of submissions, and also an outline of the proposed practice note on geothermal hazard. So I'll just go through each of those just in a little bit more detail. So firstly, in terms of supplementary evidence, during the course of the hearing, we have been promised some supplementary evidence by a couple of these submitters, Ms. Williams for RVA, Ms. Antovich in respect of First Gas, the location of those distribution lines, and also, of course, today there was one further option for supplementary. So our suggestion is that they will be provided by this Friday. There was also an opportunity extended to Kaingaora and Sigma if they wanted to respond to Ms. Fairgrave's evidence, given that it was presented out of turn. I did follow that up yesterday, although I didn't have a response. I haven't followed it up again because they may also want to respond to Ms. Fairgrave's supplementary statement. So I would suggest that if those parties do want to respond, that they also do so by this Friday. So then just turning to the section 42A reply, it would usually be my preference to provide it at the close of the hearing so that we can tie everything together at the time. But in this case, there are a number of factors supporting provision of a single comprehensive 42A reply at a later date, but not much later. You'll see that I've tried to keep that quite constrained. And the reasons for that are set out, and in some cases, the panel has provided specific comment, particularly aimed at the clarity and workability of the rules, and we're just wanting to work on that a bit further. In some instances, consideration of specific wording amendments would benefit from consultation with the relevant submitters, including, as requested, the two regional councils. And the council does also propose further discussions regarding the relevant rules with Heritage New Zealand and with Luke Nelson. And in fact, some of those discussions have already commenced with the regional councils and with Mr. Nelson. But again, further time is required just to refine the actual provisions and to circulate those changes. There are some submitters who have appeared at the hearing and in some cases didn't circulate evidence in advance and have requested new qualifying matters. And there's some examples there. In those cases, the council proposes to assist the panel by assessing those requests against the evaluation requirements for qualifying matters and advising the panel of the options that may be available to accommodate those site-specific matters. Then similarly, in respect of the proposed provisions relating to historic heritage, the council has acknowledged that there are limits on what can be achieved within Plan Change 9. However, again, the officers will consider and advise the panel of the options that may be available to address those site-specific matters. And it's for those reasons that we consider it is better to provide the Section 42A reply at a slightly later date, and we're proposing next Friday, the 1st of September for that purpose. And we will also endeavour to provide as part of that an updated version of the plan change. And I've then just suggested that the closing legal submissions be provided by the Wednesday following.
So you give the 42As 1 week and you take 2 weeks.
That's
very generous
I
of you.
had initially scheduled it for the following Friday, the 8th of September, but of course it's the RMLA conference. So I can't rely on everybody being available.
You mean we're second shift to the RMLA conference? Right.
So I bumped it to the following Wednesday. Then just in terms of the additional documents, the 2 documents that we will provide once they become available are the updated future development strategy following decisions and also just an outline of that proposed practice note on geothermal hazard. And I've just noted at paragraph 10 that those aren't matters that require significant weight, but they may well be useful to you as part of your deliberations.
And thank you for this. You've referred to the 7-day Bena School of Mātātua Marae. I wondered if it would then follow that similar qualifying matters would be considered across all schools in all marae. Those that aren't already covered by the village proposals, the whatever it is, Ohini Mutu and Whakarewere and Ngāpuna. It just strikes me that so this is at 5C. It strikes me that the issues that the school and the marae raised are issues that it would be reasonable to expect that they would follow across all schools and all marae in terms of overlooking the school and overlooking the marae. So I'm thinking aloud here is whether you what I mean.
Yeah, yes, I do get what you mean, and there are differences, particularly between schools. You will see that the school is a lot more constrained in terms of its site area than most schools, but we're certainly happy to cover that issue in the 42A reply.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And in terms of direction, I probably won't get to that until I'm back in Auckland later on today, but I will certainly get that through to Bonnie by the end of play today, as long as I get to Auckland before then. I'm in your hands in terms of that. Yeah.
Thanks, and we'll make sure that an electronic version of the memorandum is provided so that go on the website as well, just to let people know where things are at. So I will, of course, be providing a comprehensive written closing submissions, but I just wanted to present a very brief verbal closing today. Firstly, as I've noted in the memorandum, there are a number of specific matters which the Council's Section 42A officers are working through and consulting with the relevant submitters. While the submitters are largely in agreement with the intent of the provisions, the specific wording is being refined to ensure that the provisions are workable in practice. And that includes provisions relating to flood and geothermal hazards, heritage provisions, and papakainga. And in addition, as we've already noted, there are some requests from submitters for new qualifying matters, such as the school and the Matatua Marae. And again, the Council's 42A officers are working through the options that may be available to accommodate those site-specific concerns. I just note that it is tempting to comment on the rezoning request by Somerset, and particularly the suggestion that the Council, in preparing its Section 32 report in mid-2022, should somehow have taken into account the identification of the site and the FDS a year later. But I'm just going to leave that for my closing legal submissions. In closing, I want to take us back to one of the two purposes of Plan Change 9, which is to give effect to Policy 5 of the MPSUD. And Policy 5, of course, requires Plan Change 9 to enable heights and densities commensurate with the greater of the level of accessibility and relative demand. Policy 5 must be given effect in a way that also gives effect to the wider objectives and policies of the MPSUD, which includes Policy 2. Policy 2 requires the Council to provide at least sufficient development capacity to meet expected demand over the short term, medium term, and long term. However, my submission, which is consistent with the submission of Mr. Whittington for Kainga Ora, is that Policy 2 does not act as a dampener or a constraint on Policy 5. Put differently, satisfying the requirements of Policy 2 does not also satisfy Policy 5. It doesn't give you a free pass on Policy 5. In my opening submissions, I described Policy 5 as a broad discretion. That was in the context of explaining why qualifying matters do not apply to Policy 5 in the same way, that they apply to the prescriptive requirements of Policy 3 or the NDRS. However, having regard to Mr. Whittington's submissions, I accept that assessment or analysis may be a better description of what is required to give effect to Policy 5. Now, in my submission, that assessment has been carried out by Cameron Wallace in his comprehensive assessment of accessibility and relative demand, and this is included as Appendix 7 of the Section 32 report. No other party has carried out such an analysis. Ms. Fairgrave has also provided evidence of the meaning of relative demand and the need to focus development opportunities across a spatial extent which is likely to function together with and be supported by the centre. Ms. Fairgrave and Mr. Osborne agree that it is important that areas of high density residential are concentrated around and support the centre. However, in identifying where to draw the line, it is important to take into account, firstly, that the spatial extent of high density residential supports and functions together with the centres and does not risk sporadic development distant from the centres. And that's dealt with at some length in Ms. Fairgrave's evidence. Secondly, it's important to take into account constraints on development, such as additional costs associated with flood and geothermal hazards, as well as geotechnical constraints to multi-storey development such as soft ground. These constraints may not prevent development, but will affect the cost of and potentially the timing of development of some sites. And thirdly, it's important to take into account the uncertain level of uptake. Unlike a greenfield subdivision, where you're dealing with a willing landowner and a blank slate, landowners in the proposed high density residential zone are not necessarily ready and willing to develop. and many landowners in the identified area will not choose to do so for a variety of reasons. For these reasons, it is important that the opportunity for high-density residential is large enough to enable a degree of choice and potential development realisation within the market. And you've heard that this morning from Pokiroa. The council submits that it is not possible to stage the provision of high-density residential for the following reasons. Firstly, and primarily, limiting the extent of high density to provide minimum levels of development capacity will almost certainly be insufficient to meet the development capacity required by Policy 2, particularly when taking into account the factors that I've just mentioned in terms of development constraints and the uncertain level of uptake in the particular areas identified. And the example that Ms. Fairgrave provided in terms of that Whakato block is an example of that. Second, identifying a small area of land for high density development in my submission represents the direct and control approach to growth, which the NPSUD seeks to avoid and may reduce competition in the market by essentially creating winners. And I refer you specifically to Objective 2 of the NPSUD. Third, while the FDS will be reviewed every 3 years and replaced every 6 years, it is not practical for a plan change to be promoted this frequently. Even this streamlined planning process was commenced in December 2021 and will be completed by March 2024, but that's a process that has no appeals. It's not realistic for that process to be undertaken frequently. The district plan is only one part of addressing the housing crisis in Rotorua. Just because high density is enabled doesn't mean it will be established straight away. However, the district plan has been identified as a constraint on development in the past. In my submission, it is important that the district plan encourages more housing and more housing choice in the most accessible locations. Further investment can then be carried out by council as part of its implementation of the FDS to provide supporting infrastructure and to further incentivise development in the best locations. And in my submission, Plan Change 9 is the best opportunity for us to do so.
Just one query from me. I mean, it seemed to me that what you were telling us that in actual fact, Pole 2 is not really relevant because if you satisfy Pole 5, you ipso facto have satisfied Pole 2.
That doesn't necessarily follow. I mean, I suppose it's conceivable that you may have so few accessible areas that in fact that's actually not enough and you need to look at maybe rezonings and
yes, but that's not the evidence.
That's certainly not the case here.
Yeah. So from a practical point of view, we really don't need to take any account of Pole 2 apart from ticking it off as we go through.
Exactly. From a practical point of view, that's what we're here for.
Yeah.
There's two things. One, I was listening to you rather than taking notes, so I imagine you get a copy of your verbal
I can
presentation.
certainly provide that, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That'd be great. Just in terms of the Seventh-day Adventists, they're surrounded on two sides by COM4, not by a residential zone. So if we were to contemplate amendments to the provisions applying to the COM4 zone, is that actually a qualifying matter? Because it doesn't affect the NDRS.
No, it isn't a qualified matter. So we do have more flexibility on that zone and we'll definitely be covering that now. Reply.
Yeah. And the parallel one, of course, or slightly different one is the Lakeview one, which is in COMZ2, but is a residential area. And unfortunately, the body corporate didn't come before us, and their submission actually talks about some agreement that council they made with council in 2001 or something like that to protect their interests. And I was curious as to what the heck that was. So can I just flag that? That would be useful to actually address that one when you come back, because if we are minded to do anything in the way that in actual fact they sought, which is to limit height, obviously that would need to be a qualifying matter. I don't know how the heck we get there, but I mean, that almost opens the door to retirement villages, but which we have to think about. But but that isn't an interface control because it's because they are COM2. Anyway, but I'm assuming that we'll get a response on that one. Any other standing conversations? No? All right. Right, well, thank you for that. We are now, I think, we need to call Kingy in to close the hearing. If we could just get Kingy in. Now we have scheduled, we've looked at our diaries and we've scheduled our first formal deliberation session towards the back end of September. So your timing is actually very good from that point of view. I think the 29th is the date that we're anticipating getting together for the first time. Well, getting together for the first time, we'll probably start drafting before then, but obviously we'll wait to get the replies. We are obviously heading, I don't think we've agreed a firm date, but end of November is what we sort of talked through in terms of the decision. So that's on our table, and that's what we would hope to have our recommendations with council. So it's got plenty of time to make that call. And I'm assuming that my eponymous Greg Hill will have his decision out on FDS by then. But if it's not, well, it's not. I mean, as you say, it is of little weight, but it will be of interest, obviously, in terms of where that's going. And I don't think there's anything else that I need to disclose at this point in time. So I think we'll just wait for Kingy to formally close the hearing. In the meantime, thank you everybody for your participation and the assistance of council and council staff, Rick and co. Thank you very much for looking after us and Bonnie over the last week. So yes, we'll just wait for Kingy.
Just while we're waiting, I have just received a response from Kate Dan for Sidma. She has indicated that she would like to present, to provide supplementary evidence. She suggested midday tomorrow, but I'm happy to go back and just say Friday for that.
Yes, just indicate that Friday, but if she wants to hand that in tomorrow, that's fine. It gives you more opportunity to respond because you'll obviously respond to that as well through the report. Yeah, excellent. Thank you. And obviously, having indicated when we are first meeting, should those deadlines become problematic, just let us know and we can extend those, obviously, to, as long as we've got the final reply within 3 days of us meeting on the 29th, that's fine. So we can move those dates around. We'd obviously rather have your final considered, or your considered final response. Is it final considered? Yeah, no, your considered final response rather than your ill-considered final response. Yes, right.